Well, I think we're live. So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Gerhard webinar speaker series, where we discuss and champion impact investing. Welcome this evening from Cairo. My name is Hossam Allem. I'm the managing partner at a newly formed fund called the Climate Resilience Fund. With a few weeks to run till COP27, it seems that my newsfeed is full of solar power projects and green hydrogen projects that stand to reduce substantial amounts of greenhouse gases, which is wonderful and greatly needed. But it's almost as if that the entirety of the climate crisis can be distilled down to simply looking at one metric like greenhouse gases. The reality is that nature at large is under attack, and finding a way to measure and manage its impact and recovery is going to be absolutely crucial. On that topic, we have an illustrious guest speaker this evening. I'm delighted to introduce to you Marcelo Furtado. Marcelo's history is so long that I think it'll take up too much of the webinar to introduce it. So I am literally only going to introduce you to half of it, and you can judge for yourself how much he's done. So Marcelo is a visiting scholar from Columbia University. In the early parts of his career, he spent 24 years at Greenpeace, where he was, among other roles, executive director for Brazil. Among his achievements, he's the co-founder of the Brazilian Coalition on Climate, Forest and Agriculture, the co-founder of think tank Climate Sovereignty Center, CEO of the Alana and Arapiao Foundations for Sustainability. Those are two separate foundations. He's the founding partner of a startup called ZCO2, Block C for blockchain. And presumably in his spare time, he has been appointed as principal at the Taskforce on Nature Markets, which is a program within NatureFinance, which is an organization that advocates for including nature accounting in financial decision-making. Marcelo, good evening. Welcome to the speaker series. The floor is yours for a couple of minutes, and then we'll go into Q&A. To the audience, I will run the first couple of questions when Marcelo is done, but please feel free to send your questions in on the chat function, and we'll try to come around to as many of them as we can. I'll put myself on mute. Marcelo, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hassan, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. It's a great honor to be at this conversation at the Gerhard Center. I'm particularly pleased because I think that the conversation with the whole world that you will be hosting soon from Egypt as COP27 arrives gives us all a lot of hope and excitement that we'll be able to move our agenda forward. With that in mind, I thought about just using a few minutes to set up the stage of what are some of the insights that we're discussing at the Taskforce for Nature Markets, and then leave most of the time we have for question and answers, which I'm not sure if I will have the answers, but at least I'll be able to share with you some of our ways of seeing and challenging some of those questions. The basic idea of setting up, we at NatureFinance, the basic idea that we had for setting up this task force was the simple fact that nature markets are a reality. And it's not a task force for nature markets, it's a task force on nature markets, which means that we are talking about the importance and the need to shape markets to ensure that when they arise, we can ensure that they are positive and equitable, which means that from a climate that they can play a positive role and at the same time advance our equity, so needed equity agenda. So we're not advocating for markets per se, but we are advocating for when markets exist that they do play a positive and equitable role. The big question then that came up was, okay, but are there nature markets in the sense that how would one define a nature market? A nature market is basically all and any markets in which nature is traded and valued. And with that, you could consider anything like old existing markets. And I'll give an example. Agricultural commodities markets, which is around a $4 trillion market per year, or a more new nascent market, such as nature credits or biodiversity credits. When we recently did a study together with one of our knowledge partners, Vivid Economics, on the size of nature markets, the number that we came up to is that nature markets today would be the third largest economy in the world. So right after China and the US, we would have this $7.3 trillion economy, which is pretty much the nature markets economy. So when we talk about nature markets, we are talking about old markets, new markets, and also emerging markets that are coming about that we foresee coming up in the near future. And at the end of the day, when we think about how one can ensure these markets to be nature positive and equitable, we come to the conclusion that while most of the conversation is placed on what we technically call MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, I would say that the core question that actually begs a lot of attention is on governance, on how will we apply governance to those nature markets. And then comes a very interesting conversation about, well, what can we learn from existing markets such as the carbon markets and so on. So to set the stage here, I would say that looking into the Taskforce for Nature Markets in a recent paper that we launched on nature in the time of crisis, in which we outlined these general taxonomy, landscaping, sizing, we decided to work on a few areas more specifically. One of them is on the governance of nature markets. Another one is on soft commodities, because it is the largest nature market we have. Another one is on nature crimes, which one would argue is the other side of the coin that requires a lot of attention. And the fourth one is nature credits, because we foresee that one important revenue stream for conservation and for a bioeconomy will be the capability and the capacity for us to generate positive outcomes from those credits. So in a nutshell, that's what we're trying to do. Who is NatureFinance? We are an organization recently emerged from the Finance for Biodiversity. So we migrated from Finance for Biodiversity to our new name, Nature Credit. We became a foundation based in Geneva to do so, to engage with the financial sector. And we are the secretariat of the task force. Now, the task force has an incredible wealth of very important and true experts on this space of nature markets that goes anywhere from an indigenous leader like Almir Surui to a former finance minister like Joaquin Levy, or Maria Fernanda Espinosa, former head of UN, Vien Sharif, 16 illustrious peoples, 12 knowledge partners, and our role is basically just be a facilitator of this process. So with that, let me just end by saying that let's remember that 100% of the economy is 100% dependent on nature. And the reason why we're having this conversation is because we know that given the urgency of climate change and biodiversity loss, we need to make sure that when we shape our economy looking into the future, we're looking at one that provides these positive and equitable outcomes. So with that, I'd rather just now engage on a Q&A and see if we can have a more exciting conversation with that.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. That was very illuminating, but I might ask you just to take us a little bit from the top and explain to us, in what way can we put a monetary value on nature? If there's a stretch of coral reef that's been damaged, how can we value, what somebody should be paid to regenerate it? If there's a square kilometer of Amazon rainforest that has been leveled, how can we value what somebody should be paid to help it restore itself as rainforest? You're on mute, Marcelo.
After so many years, one should learn how to click that button, right? I'll start by saying that most of the conversation today is pivoting on the very specific ways one can measure these positive outcomes. So we're looking at any kind of work like the ones that are being done on sizing how much carbon seagrass is absorbing, or a square kilometer of rainforest in the Amazon, and so on. Then the next step is, how can we validate that this is indeed happening? And then how can I report this and ensure perennity of this? And what kind of technology can I use in order to go over transparency, to go over shareability of the data, reliability of the data, and so on. For many of those challenges, Hassan, I would say that we have a mix of technology availability and learning lessons from the carbon conversation we already have evolving for a few years that allows us to come up with those concepts and put them in practical form. I think where we noticed that there was a gap is actually when we look at how do we govern that. And if you were to trade that from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction, how would you ensure that in this process there is no double counting, that in this process there is indeed a guarantee that the positive output that you are referring to will indeed happen? How can you ensure that in the actual location, in the jurisdiction in which this nature element is being protected and valued, you have enough implementation of enforcement and so on to ensure that this will exist in a longer period of time? And a lot of examples and very creative ones have been developed, but our assessment is that the largest challenge we have lies much more on the governance piece to ensure that we have an actual environment in which we can ensure that these elements are not becoming part of greenwash on one hand, or in the other hand, when you look at how do you trickle down the economic benefit of it, you include all the key participants, all the key stakeholders in it. And I think there comes one important element, particularly we see that in many forest conversations, which is at the end of the day, forest communities and indigenous peoples happen to be a group highly responsible for the maintenance of existing forests. And yet, when you think about processes in which you will reward existing forests, standing forests, for the biodiversity positive impacts, environmental services they offer, climate regulatory services, water, they rarely see the trickle-down effect where they get to be a participant on this. A participant, I mean, in the economic sense of the benefit. That also brings a lot of other questions. For example, some people would argue that, but wait a minute, maybe not every and all nature should be monetized and commercialized. Maybe we should have no-go zones or no-go areas in which nature shouldn't be monetized and so on. And unless you have proper governance structures to ensure that these architectures are possible, we will always have two events possible. One is exploitation of the differences in quality of different approaches, in which then you will have people, moreover, exploring the gaps, and that's where our nature crimes work comes in, where we're looking at making sure that we can actually demonstrate robust positive output. And the other one is on the pricing. Every time the finance sector is unsure about a certain risk, they internalize that risk, and that has an impact on the price. And what we've seen in history is that nature-rich economies that tend to be global south economies get a lower pricing for the carbon you would offer there because there is a perception of a higher risk. So if that boils down to the pricing of it, it then begs the question of, if we have nature markets, how can we ensure that these markets are indeed fair, and by being fair on a price basis that they can actually use and monetize this for a value that preserves the ecosystem in which we're talking about, but at the same time is equally valuable for the global market of nature credits.
Marcelo, the carbon markets took about 30 years to get to where they are today. By the time that the world had brought it from the abstract into the implementable, and that countries had aligned behind a common vision and organizations had set quite a sophisticated degree of governance around it. And now they're talking about net zero by 2050. That seems to be the catchphrase. So that's a sort of 50-year life cycle of getting the idea to fully implementing and seeing the action. You are right at the front end of the nature markets. I presume you don't feel that we have 50 years to fix this. And this is an infinitely more complex, multidimensional issue. You're at the cold face of this. You're at the sharp end. What is your prognosis or forecast to alignment of stakeholders and countries behind this quite sophisticated new method of accounting, and how soon can it be activated?
Well, the good thing is that at the Taskforce, we don't need to make predictions. Our job right now is to make assessments and pose questions and hopefully suggest ways forward on how to address something. We're actually just developing right now our paper on governance for nature markets, which we hope to launch early January next year. And many of those questions are arising, Hassam, from this conversation. I would start with a simple response that part of the reason we got ourselves in this messy space in carbon is because we did not undertake the governance issue with the importance and the strategic scope it has from day one. And we can actually learn from those mistakes and avoid repetition. The second point I would raise is when we started this conversation on carbon, we had a fraction of the available technology. And I'm not mentioning technology only from the capacity for satellite monitoring with very sharp imaging capability, but also about smart contracts, blockchain, and so on, that one could use now for the benefit. But to be very honest, I don't think that those are the true limitation factors. I think that the true limitation factors are much more on how do we as society are prepared to, on a regional basis or a multilateral basis, be able to secure agreements in which we can agree on basic sets, basic report capabilities, and so on. And as we see the world moving forward, and as a crisis, as a nature crisis, we're not seeing things getting better. And in fact, if there is anything, the recent conflict in Europe in the Russia-Ukraine war only showed us of how interlinked we all are and how much nature dependent our economy is. I think we're learning from that, that number one, because of this war, energy that was already a security matter now has another element, which is food, as a security matter. And the reason that happened has to do with the fact that we're seeing two elements at stake here. One is the way we are treating nature. So there is the whole discussion about the capability of producing food, the capability of stopping deforestation, but there's also an economic element, which is how do we trade these commodities, and do we pay the true price of these commodities? And when paying the true price of these commodities, are we sharing the benefits from the countries that are, by producing this food, keeping our nature standing? At the end of the day, the most important element that we see coming out of that is most countries are looking for solutions in an uncoordinated way, and while internalizing the risks that we're seeing on energy and food and so on, the price of energy and the price of food started skyrocketing. And when prices started skyrocketing, you already have a challenge, because more poor countries and poor economies will have much more difficulty to have access to nutrition than others. So the whole equity conversation that we started this webinar with falls behind. So I think that the reason why we will have to address these matters in a different pace and with a different level of political will is, number one, because we have a survival element attached to it. But the number two is because one can see that by not operating in a coordinated fashion, by not having public policy aligned to internalization of climate and nature risk, and by not having a governance approach, which will not be equal to all, but maybe we could have a set of key principles that drive us, we will not see opportunities coming up and arising as an economic co-benefit from us moving to an extractive society to a regenerative society. So the reason I'm looking at this with a more optimistic point of view is because we're seeing, and even a recent study we did that we launched 2 weeks ago, and we'll have a webinar this coming Wednesday, we've noticed that in a modeling exercise that we've done globally, and then for a specific jurisdiction, and we use Brazil just as a case, we saw that when the finance sector internalized nature climate risk aligned with public policy, you can get more jobs and at a lower cost for your economy than if you were to internalize it without public policy framing, meaning leaving financial institutions to do it as they want in an uncoordinated fashion. So I think that because we have positive economic outputs, because we have to address a hunger challenge, we have to address a climate challenge, and we have to address a nature challenge, we have all these elements as driving forces that could put us in a different track. But you're right, if we choose to ignore what we've done as mistakes in the past, and if we choose to ignore how we have to embrace on many of these challenges working together, the further we take action will make prices go up, insecurity go up, and the equity issue go down.
Could I ask you to expand a bit on the Brazil example you gave a moment ago, where investment and regulation aligned, and you were able to find that there were better economics that supported livelihoods and job, just at a very kind of practical level? Where was the money flowing from and to? Just help me understand the accounting of this. And I've got some more questions after.
So first of all, let me just frame to you, if you go to our website, NatureFinance, you'll be able to see all these reports there. But basically, the work we commissioned was first a global modeling that gave, looking at 4 normative outcomes: nature, internalization of risk for nature, climate, access to nutrition, and jobs. And the question we had was, when addressing nature and climate crisis, do we really have positive outcomes in terms of access to nutrition and jobs. And once we got the answer for the global exercise, for the global modeling was yes, we can get more jobs and we can get more access to nutrition. And then we said, okay, but this is just a global model in a world that doesn't really exist, which is this global world. So let's try to bring that down to a real economy. And then we used real economy data, modeling Brazil as an economy. And in that, we came up with the same results, which then begs the question, okay, but to get the economic benefits and in order to get the creation of jobs, what are the public policies that the financial sector should be engaging with? And then we came up with 6 different types of public policies. One on consumers, one on small farmers, one on intensification and making agriculture more sustainable, and one on alternative proteins, indicating that even for food-producing countries, addressing the challenges of developing alternative proteins was a positive way to move your economy and to generate jobs. So what I'm saying here, Hussam, is that if countries and economies and investors do not understand that actually working together with the investment track aligned with public policy, but then, of course, the right public policy, it will be more expensive, more time consuming, and eventually we will not generate the jobs we need to enhance our economy. But if we choose to engage with public policy and we have a clear idea of what are the core the core public policies that we need, we can address that. The example of Brazil came up with these 6 recommendations. I'm assuming that if we were to do it in Africa or in Southeast Asia, we will probably come with a different set of specific recommendations. But by and large, I would be surprised if the areas, the general areas we're talking about, would not be the same, because at the end of the day, what these markets have in common is they're all tropical agricultural markets, and therefore facing many of the similar challenges, such as deforestation, or many of the similar opportunities.
On the opportunity, is there something else that they have in common, that they are maybe not as sophisticated agricultural economies as perhaps others are, and so the journey to regenerative is shorter than perhaps a highly mechanized economy is?
Here, I would say that our research, particularly on the soft commodities conversation within the Taskforce for Nature Markets, which is a deep discussion we did interviewing traders in Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia. And we used 3 different models, 3 different cases to discuss that. We discussed the case of soya in Brazil, we discussed the case of cocoa in Africa, and we discussed the case of palm oil in Southeast Asia. And if you ask me what is the common trend that we got from this approach, is the number one thing we've noticed is it's very important for you to understand the regional connections of your markets, because different regions have different eating habits and different needs. The second one was, when looking at this, if you look at commodities just as a basic export commodity, you may be missing a very important part, which is the processing of those commodities, the processing of those into what we call maybe more technological advanced alternative protein conversation. And then it doesn't need to be necessarily only the plant-based meat as a replacement for animal meat, but maybe also engaging on fermentation, engaging on lab meat, and so on, which begs a question, Hussam, which is how are we also going to deal with technology transfer, given that in general, many times the technology is owned or generated where the food is not produced, and where the food is produced, you lack that access to technology. And one reminder, it's also important to do on this, which we're seeing a lot on this discussion of alternative protein, is that even the most sophisticated technology to produce meat in laboratories, you will still need probably sugar as an intake. And that sugar will still come from a nature-based production. So the concept that you can be fully independent of nature is a concept that one may find itself challenged. We recognize that right now, the world is facing at least two big challenges. One is, what if we cannot stick to the 1.5 degrees? And what if we engage on a world that is actually between 2 to 3 degrees warmer and not be able to stick to the 1.5? If that happens, we will have a whole different map of not only food production, but as nature markets per se. How does that look like? And how are we as society looking at it? And I'm not saying only governments, I'm talking about how the private sector is looking into this, how academia is looking into this, how civil society is looking into this. And this is a conversation that is already happening, but we need to make sure that it happens within the framework of not discouraging us from reaching the 1.5 degree, but at the same time, allowing us space and planning and opportunities to understand the impacts of missing that target. The second conversation is, if you are a food producing country and you have nature and you have land and you have water, that's one aspect, that's one capability. But if you now, concerned by what you saw in the Russia-Ukraine war, and you decided that at least a percentage of your food production should be done nationally, should be done at your own control, it made a few countries, or maybe some additional countries, consider, how can we produce food without being so nature dependent? So vertical farming and other technologies are popping up. I think those are two trends that are sparking investors, policymakers, and society at large to look into the future and try to figure out, in this new reality, if those things were to happen and take place, how would we address investments? How would we address trade? How would we invest technology transfer? How would we invest pricing for all this? Another two, remembering, understand that we still need to deliver to the planet a solution to the climate crisis and to the biodiversity loss.
Marcelo, for thousands of years, the world did not function with mass investment. And my question to you is this: is this discussion being framed in the context of markets and trade to basically unlock the only really potent tool we have of our time, which is capital markets and investment? Is that the best way to tackle this crisis, or is it what we've got?
I would answer it probably in a different way, but I'm going to land at the same place, because the way you're asking the question, you're basically also saying, look, we're missing a huge opportunity here by ignoring the important role markets have in shaping our economic outputs. And in that, you're absolutely right. The second part of the question you're probably asking with this is, and of course, to have positive outcomes, we need to shape markets to operate in a positive way. And the history of our markets have not been so often positive. And let's take soft commodities as an example. While we have this incredible opportunity, that's not what we have seen. So the easy answer I would give to you is yes, of course. And that's the reason why, on one hand, we at the Taskforce are discussing how can we shape soft commodities markets for $1 trillion per year market, that if we can shift it to be nature positive and climate positive, will be a huge contribution to our challenges in the world. But at the same time, we're discussing new markets, which are in a scale much smaller today, but evolving, such as nature credits markets. So yes, I think working on markets is pivotal and super important. Having said that, I think we will also have to understand that as society, we may come to the conclusion that not everything will be marketable, but whatever is marketable can be nature positive and equitable.
Marcelo, we have a question from the floor and there's a hand up. Let me start with the floor question, and it goes like this. Regarding the need to share costs and benefits of actions and outcomes, do you have any concrete examples where sharing mechanisms have successfully been implemented?
Yeah, that's a great question, because in designing now our governance paper, we're trying to come up with exactly those examples. And we're looking at governance from a sandwich approach. We're looking at governance as something one has to do, looking at top-down strategies and also some bottom-up strategies. In the water management side, we've seen and identified some very interesting initiatives that are showing high potential for bottom-up equitable sharing of water credits. We have a partner, Civic Ledger, that is working with that in 3 different jurisdictions. They're doing some work in Latin America, doing some work in the US, and doing some work in Australia, where they're based. And they're doing this using technology, blockchain, as a tool, but the secret sauce of how they can actually implement this is actually by looking at community engagement to ensure the governance piece. And then I think, Hossam, if I finish my answer there, you would immediately jump and say, but how can that be scalable? And that is one of the questions we're coming up with, which is, while these solutions will always be very much related to the characteristic of the local jurisdiction, there may be common trends, common elements that can be scalable. And those are the elements we are exploring right now. There's also work being done with another partner on seagrass with small islands, looking at how they can look at nature credits, looking at their seagrass production, and not only the carbon sequestration that the seagrass does, but also all the co-benefits in terms of biodiversity, water quality, fisheries, engagement with tourism, and so on. And finally, we're looking at also forest-based strategies in where you can look at co-benefits and co-products from agroforestry arrangements. So we will come up with some of those examples, hoping that they illustrate that a combination of MRVs with good technology, implemented with good community and engagement with society, and with that, a good policy framework, one can have that implemented. What I think will be the next challenge for this conversation is, can we trade that among different constituencies? Can you imagine a stock exchange based in the US, in Africa, in Europe, in Latin America, that will be able to commercialize these credits in order to funnel not only resources that are coming for offset reasons, but also resources that are coming for positive impact reasons. And we're also exploring that opportunity with different knowledge partners that are engaging on this kind of approach, which then brings a whole other layer of governance issues, which are not necessarily regulatory policy making from governments, but actually regulatory frameworks that the financial sector itself could do using central banks resolutions, stock exchange regulatory commissions, and so on. So just to keep in mind that when we say regulatory approach and governance, we're not saying hard law only.
Thank you. We have a hand up from Dr. Ali Aouni of the Gerhard Center. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Hussein. Thank you, Marcelo, for a very interesting webinar. For me, when I listen nature, preserving nature, the first thing that comes to mind are nature protected areas or nature reserves, parks. Now, a natural progression of this, what is called a biosphere. And a biosphere, my understanding is the idea is that I try to get populations living in naturally sensitive areas to coexist and to live well, reasonably well, within the boundaries of nature. Now, an interesting observation when you look at the biosphere concept in Egypt, it tends to be run by the government, basically, which is the Ministry of Environment. So, I mean, it's in the fringes, nobody hears of it. Now, the other extreme is when you look at it in Lebanon, and the one I have in mind is called Arz al-Shouf, which is basically Druze. And it's actually managed by a foundation, by a Druze foundation. A Druze is one of the sects in Lebanon. And it is fantastic, the way they have hotels, and it's sort of eco-hotels. They have products from the oldest cedar trees around, etc., etc. So the ownership of a foundation made a hell of a difference than an owner of a government. And they preserve the location, which is, I think if you make it purely private also, they might turn it into a Disney World kind of tourism. So my question is this biosphere model something that could be advanced, that could be progressed? That's one. The second part, which is tied to it, I mean, obviously there is a need for proof of concept. When you talk about proof of concept, it means there is a high risk. A high risk meaning your regular investor, even a venture investor, might not have appetite for it. But that's going to open a door for blended type of financing. I'm talking about, again, I'm talking about philanthropic money that might come in and show proof of concept. So you can take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. And I would answer your question the following way. I think that we have to be open to a mosaic of approaches, because while you are indicating one example that you are framing as, here's a great solution run by a foundation, but maybe a private and a government one wouldn't be so successful. Depending on the jurisdiction you're talking about, there may be government-led examples that do work, and there may be private sector-led examples that do work. At the end of the day, the bottom question falls again on the governance issue, because nature is a public good, and therefore nature has to be responded to beyond our generation to future generations. So independent on what is the regulatory framework you're choosing, there is a public good element that has to be respected. When we did our technical definition, of what a nature market is, we said it's a system composed by transactions between separate buyers and sellers, in which the transacted good or service specifically respects a stock of ecosystem assets or a flow of ecosystem services on terrestrial or aquatic ecosystems. And then we said, and that can happen in an intrinsic way, in a credit, in an asset, or in a derivative. that is what we see evolving, and conservation will be one example of those architectures, the one you exemplified, but you can have, and conservation for us will be part of this intrinsic market, which is the market where you have provisioning, regulatory framework, you have cultural ecosystem service, and that all these things can be of a direct economic benefit. And in general, I would say the payment for the ecosystem services is what arises from that. We have in NatureFinance a recent initiative connected to sustainability-linked debt, where we are indicating that countries that can prove that they are managing well their nature should have a benefit on how they have their debt being negotiated. So a direct link between their finances with their nature stocks. This is all to say, Ali, that yes, you're right. I think we need a mosaic approach. Yes, you're right. There are many different levels of players that can come in. But at the end of the day, philanthropy and impact investment and all that can play a critical role, but they are a very small amount of resources compared to what I think Hossein was referring in the beginning, which is large stocks of resources, large investors. And we want to see those investors understanding that unless we have a climate safe and a nature positive world, there will be no economy. We want those investors to understand that when you have good public policy aligned with the internalization of climate and nature risk in financial decisions, you have better outcomes. So I think the challenge we're trying to address here is to translate to the financial sector that it is in their own benefit to engage in this discussion, to participate in the investments of this discussion, and to participate on the innovations that we need to develop in order to get the system to the optimum phase. But the excuse that we're not there yet, country X or Y is not prepared to do this, they lack enforcement, these are all lame excuses for us to address the urgency in which we need to have a planet that survives the climate crisis, retains our nature because we depend on it, and allows our population, our people to survive.
Marcelo, a question from me. The greenhouse gas fight was in some respects quite abstract. What one country did could affect the weather patterns in another country on the other side of the planet. And it made it a kind of very global abstract challenge that everybody had to rise to in a synchronized and coordinated fashion. Is the nature markets challenge more local in that respect? That the impact that Egypt has on its nature is quite local, and therefore the recovery and economics is more local. Is that correct? And if that's the case, is that a help or a hindrance to quick action?
I would say, Hossein, that while I think nature markets are very specifically designed by their local characteristics, when we monetize that and we create, for example, nature credits, there's no reason why nature credits cannot be commercialized and negotiated in a global scale. So while the design to ensure that this is a robust, accurate system that can deliver the positive outputs that we are aiming for, that can deliver the equitable outcomes we're aiming for, are local, I don't think that the economic benefits of what we're seeing here cannot be offered, traded, and therefore negotiated at a larger scale. Why this is important? Because my fear is if we imagine this local market, this local challenge as a local market, we'll never get to the scale and the impact that we need. So we will need to address this, and that's why governance plays such a crucial role. We will have to resolve this in a way that it doesn't matter if it is a forest in Egypt or a seagrass land in Barbados or the Amazon forest in Brazil. One will have to be able to look at this all as a nature market in which we want positive outcomes and equitable outcomes. And there should be a pricing exercise that is not exploitive of currency fluctuations, economic downturns, and so on. You're looking at this also from the positive benefit this provides to the whole planet. So if this is important for the planet, and it's important for a wealthy society in Europe or in the US, it has to pay the true price, the fair price for also who is doing the job in the global south. So I think that when we're talking about this issue, I just fear that the word local may detach, may divide us in a north-south, which I think that we've seen on the carbon space with the difference in which we treat forest-based carbon to a renewable energy-based carbon.
We have a question coming in from our friends at USAID who are on the call, and they're turning their attention to COP27. And this question's a bit long, so I'll summarize it, but it is, are you attending COP27, and is this topic being discussed at COP27? Are there any sort of forums that we could watch out for? And are there any milestones that you're expecting to be achieved at COP27 around this topic?
From all we are hearing, and you know, Egypt hosts the presidency of the COP, so you may be much better informed than me to answer that question. From all I'm hearing is, number one, what COP27 does not want is more promises. We understand that what COP27 won is clear indications on how we implement and deliver impact. And that's very much aligned to what the Taskforce on Nature Market wants, and that's very much aligned to what NatureFinance is all about. The second point is it has been a big discussion about how do we combine climate and nature, and who's more important, and how much money should one get, the other get. We at NatureFinance, we understand, we look at this as a systems approach. And as far as we're concerned, we need to address both. And therefore, we think that yes, COP27, particularly looking at the finance developments, looking at outcomes of COP27, we should have this element very much on the front end. There has been a recent announcement in Cairo for this sustainability-linked bonds that I mentioned to you, where we are engaging with a number of key players looking at designing a hub that can assist countries to link their sovereign debt to sustainability outcomes, which means nature positive, climate positive outcomes. And we think that this would be one element that could be further discussed and advanced at COP27. The other one is the presidency of the COP has highlighted the importance of the food discussion in an area in which we're seeing hunger exploding again. And for us, knowing that soft commodities, and particularly agricultural commodities, is the largest nature market we have today in the planet, it means that discussing nature markets is a critical matter, and discussing not only the trends and challenges we see ahead, but also the importance role we have on pricing nature credits. It will be quite pivotal for this because we see this incredible opportunity. And as I said in the beginning, our task force is called Task Force on Nature Markets and not Task Force for Nature Markets, which means that our role, and we see the conversation, is how can we ensure that we shape these markets to go on the right direction? So how can we shape, for example, the soft commodities markets to deliver nature positive and equitable outcomes? We think that COP27 is a perfect place to have not only this conversation, but actually actions coming out of it that moves this conversation forward, because the only way we can address access to nutrition, therefore reduction of hunger, and at the same time, a better position of more resiliency vis-a-vis food security or climate change, is by shaping these markets, is by having this conversation, understanding key drivers, key leverages, and implementing actions, be them bottom up, top down, things that countries can do individually, things that countries should be doing together, things that the finance sector can be a leader, things that the private sector can be a leader, things that academia and civil society could guide. And that is the combination that we see so powerful. For that very reason, and when you look at the characteristic of the 16 task force members, you're going to see that we have that kind of diversity in our leadership. We have folks from all these areas engaging and trying to together provide insights and knowledge to how can we advance this conversation, knowing that for some of them, the solutions are quite complex. For others, there may be already existing examples, but we have to be committed to impact on the ground at COP27.
So which sessions are you attending that we should keep our eye on?
Well, we're looking very much at the Finance Day as one critical day for these discussions. We're very much interested on the food, on the biodiversity day, and on water day. So I think that the COP27 was quite right in allocating this wide scope and these specific themes. But as we look at this as a nature finance lens and as a task force for nature markets, we look at many opportunities throughout those 2 weeks. What will be very important for us is that we allow ourselves to get maybe out of our comfort zone of always going to these COPs in order to say the same things, make the same promises, and look like we're on the right side of history, to maybe be a little bit more risk-taking and ask ourselves the questions, if we really want to shape, for example, a soft commodity market to be nature positive, what can my organization, my knowledge, my input, my resources, how can it be applied for that outcome? If I want to have a sustainably linked sovereign debt program in my country, who do I need to engage? How I need to do it? How would be the indicators? And there is so much information. There are so many players. There's so much technology. There are so many ideas out there that oftentimes it seems to us that it's much more the bold willingness to actually take the risk, assemble it, and do it that we're missing. So in that sense, we're highly welcoming the idea that we're hearing from the COP presidency to make this a COP about impact and not a COP that we're inviting more and more pledges that at the end of the day, people look back and ask themselves if those were for real.
Marcelo, thank you very much. We have wrapped up the hour. Time flies when you're saving the world. We want to thank you for your participation, and to the audience, thank you for joining this evening. Keep your eyes on your emails for upcoming speaker series. The next one is being shown on screen now. For now, all that is left to say is thank you very much to our guest speaker, Marcelo Furtado, and to the rest of you for joining. Thank you, as usual, to the AUC for hosting us. Have a lovely evening and a great rest of week. All the best for now.
Thank you, Hussam. And I just want to encourage folks to go to our website, naturefinance.net. There's a wealth of information there. And more importantly, we love working with others. So you see a number of partner organizations that are doing all this work with us. And this collaborative approach is what I think makes us a different organization and maybe a more risk-taking organization. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody. Bye for now.